Hello and welcome back, everyone, to another Quarantine with Brennifry. As always, I'm Tori. Today we're going to be talking about March. Pretty exciting week for me. I mean, I say exciting in the sense that I binge watched two separate shows. So that's what I did, and it was really great. I had a great time doing that. I watched Never Have I Ever, and I binge watched Umbrella Academy 2. Both were great. I thought Umbrella Academy 1 was better than season 2, but I still really liked it. They made some choices that I was like, okay. But I still liked it very much, and I'm looking forward to number 3. Never Have I Ever was great. I cannot wait for season 2. I was like, I didn't think, okay, so Brenda did like, watch this show. And then like typical me was like, yeah, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then like Netflix was like,
whoa, hold up. Let's not move past that too quickly. See, it's not just me. All right, Jen, I'm not the only one who says, hey, I'll get to it when I get to it. Tori does it too. I just want that out.
Like, I got to catch up on superhero shows and all this other stuff. And then when I had finished binge watching, I don't remember what I was binge watching before. Pokemon. I finished watching Pokemon Journeys, and then it was like shows you might like, and it started just playing the trailer of Never Have I Ever, and I was like, I didn't realize it was Never Have I Ever, and I was like, wait, the show looks really good. Then I saw the name, I was like, wait, isn't that what they told me to watch? And then I texted them, I was like, did you tell me to watch this? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna watch it. It's real good. Loved it though. It was super great. I started watching. So I have DC Universe, so I have HBO Max for like $5 or whatever with their deal, and I started watching Batwoman because I didn't watch it when it was on the air, just because I don't have cable, and I don't hate it so far, but I'm only on episode 3, so we'll see what happens. But so far I don't hate it. I know it got a lot of hate, but so far I don't hate it. But with that, I'll toss it on over to Jen.
I think Brenda.
Oh, share. Sorry. Hi. I can share things. My share of the week. There are 2 separate keychains that I got as gifts individually. Sonic is from Jen, because I'm a big Sonic fan, and he's got a little ring in his hand right here, you can see. And then Froppy, aka Sue, is from My Hero Academia, and my former embedded tutor I worked with turned friend named AJ got her for me. And yeah, I love them. I keep them on my desk. I have this really nice, it's like 2 bulls pulling a like cart that Brenda's mom got for me when she visited a family in El Salvador. And these 2 hang from one of their little like the wheel spikes. So that's where they live, on my desk. That's also number Jen.
I think usually Brenda goes second.
You're to my left right now.
I think it's usually however we appear on his screen. You can go, Jen.
Do I go, or do you want to go, Brenda?
I'll go.
Okay.
All right. So this week has been busy. A lot of reading. I haven't had a chance to really watch TV, except to like, it's just playing as I fall asleep because I'm so exhausted at the end of the day. But actually, yesterday I started watching Steven Universe after Jen recommended the series. And see, this time
I've never seen it. How is it?
It's okay. So we like Backstagers, right?
Yeah.
I think you'll enjoy Steven Universe. It is just such a happy, fluffy, and lovable show. And Jen, it is so wholesome. I haven't watched it enough. I was falling asleep as I was watching it, so I only really got through 2 episodes before exhaustion hit me. It's a good show. I really enjoyed it. But I'm sure Jen can speak more to it. Just no spoilers, Jen. Or actually, I don't mind spoilers. So anyway, it's been out forever. So
my students always write on it too. Like they are obsessed with it as well. So
I mean, it's so
to watch list.
Happy. Yeah, it's really bright and happy. But for the most part, I've just been reading a lot this week. A lot of student papers, a lot of research. I went back and reread the novel that my students need to read in the next 2 weeks, Children of Blood and Bone. It is such a good novel written by Tomi Adeyemi. It is awesome. It's just such a good novel. I paired it with Harry Potter, so we'll see how that goes. Adeyemi just does such a good job of building a world, but it's a heartbreaking novel in every sense of the word. I think I was crying every other chapter, and there was a point where I just had to close it and stop and think, what am I doing to myself and to my students, my poor kids, right? But it's a worthwhile reading, I think. So yeah, it's a good novel. So if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. My share of the week is actually a callback to my thesis. So it is from the Build-A-Bear workshop.
Oh,
This is my little teddy bear Wonder Woman. And
it's
so,
so
isn't she
In a
happy?
while. I haven't seen her in a long time.
Yeah. So Build-A-Bear had a collection of like superheroes, and since I wrote my graduating thesis on Wonder Woman and some of the intersectional failures that occur in Grant Morrison's novel, when she came out, I was like, I want her. She's too cute. And so I have her. Yeah. This is Diana with her little bracelets and her little tiara. And she has a little dress. There was a different outfit for her, but I really like the dress because it has a tutu, and I just think tutus are the best things. I've never owned one. I've never actually worn one either, but they just look adorable, right? I don't know. But yeah, that was my share of the week. Jen, how you doing this week?
I'm doing okay. Just I feel like the semester is right around the corner, and I have somewhat pressure back in my mind that I should probably start prepping for my class. I feel very awful to my university's bookstore and like my department's admin because I haven't submitted a book list because I still haven't figured out what I want to teach because this is my first time teaching a 110 course. I've done the stretch version of it, but I haven't done just the one semester version of it. I did substitute, but substitution is different than actually running your own course.
Yeah, and to be fair, when we substituted, we only really came in for the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Right, quite different. So I really just am trying to think about it, and I also feel like build the thing onto Blackboard, which is just not something I'm looking forward to. So sleep continues to elude me. I think it's a little bit hotter this weekend, and I think that's really what's messing with my sleep schedule as well. In terms of what I've been doing, I've been watching a lot of TV. So like one of the reasons I ended up watching Steven Universe is because I'm almost halfway through Netflix, and so I'm running out of things to watch. And so I don't know, like Hulu had a recent platform change in terms of just how it looks like right now. And so like I was exploring that, and it recommended certain things to me. And so Steven Universe was under the animation line for me. And so I was like, hey, I remember like going to WonderCon and hearing this guy present on this paper on Steven Universe and just utopianism. And, I don't think he's right for that. I don't think utopianism was right for Steven Universe, actually. But, why not give it a shot? And I ended up, it's quick. It's like 15 minutes per episode and light and fluffy. And that's kind of where my brain is anyways. But I ended up really liking the show. Like, it's actually really wholesome. And it's fluffy, but it has substance. So if you're fans of like Giant Days, if you're fans of Backstages is a really great parallel actually, you'd enjoy it. I can see why Boom Comics specifically as a comic company decided to pick up Steven Universe to run comics off of it, because that's Steven Universe fits their brand in a really nice way. So I think it's really, and then I started reading up more about the show, and apparently like the show was created by the first female creator for Cartoon Network. So she was just like the first female creator to own the show on Cartoon Network, which I thought was great, but also like that was 10 years ago. Like we didn't have more female creators.
Yeah, like it's insane.
Right. Yeah, and then I enjoyed, this is a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I enjoyed, there is apparently like in a feature, like in the epilogue season, there's a reference of Steven just offhandedly mentioning that, he is going to therapy, it's just included in dialogue. And I thought that was such a like great piece to include in a children's show, normalizing therapy and how that's okay, right? And especially for something as fluffy as Steven Universe, I thought that was a great choice. So that made me want to really concentrate on the show a little bit more, focus on the show a little bit more. And then also, I just want to put a plug out there because Brenda made me aware of this on social media. But Netflix and recently got the rights to a lot of Black-led shows. So it's really exciting to hear that Sister Sister is going to come onto Netflix on September 1st. Moesha just dropped on Netflix yesterday. And like the other half.
Oh yeah.
Brothers is gonna have Girlfriends is gonna come on at some point.
Oh my goodness, I can't, you guys. Okay, so we have to acknowledge, right? These shows framed my young adulthood, right? Like this, like when I was transitioning from a child to, I guess, a preteen, and early teens, Moesha, Sister Sister, like all of these shows were not just my beat, but like those are the things I was
loved Sister Sister so much. I was obsessed with that show. And the twins themselves, like Tia and Tamara, were like great. Like I loved Twitches, like so anything they were in,
I love that show. I'm so happy that it's gonna be on Netflix because if you know, for anyone who's fans of the show, Brenda knows this trial too, like it's so hard to find these shows on DVD. Like for a long time they were not distributed, and then for a long time they weren't part of these streaming networks. So like only recently have we gotten like the Living Single, which Brenda has talked about profusely on Hulu. I've also been watching Fresh Prince of Bel-Air on HBO Max this past week, which I loved growing up, and it's actually so great to rewatch because it was so current, right? And so community driven, and just making Black voices heard in terms of just who was in the industry at the time, right? And so I really enjoyed that. So just yay, I had to share that news because like I love these shows, and I'm so happy that like these shows are being finally included into these streaming platforms, and people have more access to these shows now, because these are great pieces.
Yeah. My slightly unrelated but related to the Steven Universe bit, my student had written in a paper last semester that I take it with a grain of salt. I don't know how true it is, but they were researching and writing, and they chose to write on Steven Universe, and they were saying that the creator wanted to have a queer wedding on the show, and Cartoon Network said no, and the creator said, if you don't allow this, I'm walking. And it was at the point where Steven Universe was getting so many ratings that she basically bullied Cartoon Network into letting her have a queer wedding on screen in a child show, and I think that's fucking amazing. Like
the show itself is very progressive. I can, in terms of how it deals with trauma, how it deals with just gender, right, fluidity, and like even just identity. It deals with like relationships as well really well, and just I think it does a really great job at normalizing same-sex relationships. It's just, as of course they exist, and not really spending much time with it. So yeah, I think it's for a fluffy show. It really is just a fluffy show. It has a lot of substance.
Yeah.
And the music's great. Like I didn't expect the music to be great too, but it is. So yeah, definitely a great recommend if you just need something in the background just to have for like 160. Yeah, for 160 episodes, you can have it in the background. So my share of the week is this piece here. I recently bought this. I haven't framed it.
We both have Wonder Woman things this week. That's funny.
It's the side says, "What I do is not up to you." So this artist would have normally been going to cons. They're from Emerald City. I found out about them because they were posting on Instagram. They did a virtual con with other artists, and so I ended up really liking their work. And I ended up purchasing 2 pieces from them. But I thought that was what I really enjoyed about that work was just like the quote on the side, and then of course I love the Gal Gadot version of Wonder Woman. So I really wanted to have that kind of piece in my life, I guess. And eventually it'll go up somewhere in my room. But so for this month, we are in August, and we've been trying to adhere to like monthly themes, and we usually also kind of adhere to sort of like national monthly themes as well. August didn't have a very strong national theme. I think it was American Artists, right? Month or something like that. And so instead we really talked about this, and we landed on this theme of representation matters. We want to continue talking about diverse voices in media, and to kind of launch us into our discussion for the month, we decided to choose March, Book 1, written by John Lewis and Andrew Aiden, and I'm looking to the side because I actually have the book, and put together by Nate Powell. This is an autobiography of John Lewis's life, who is one of the more prominent members of the civil rights movement. He recently died, which was kind of struck the nation at its heart, because one of the most prominent civil rights movement leaders is no longer with us. And so we really wanted to highlight his work, his life, and talk about this really neat contribution to the graphic novel continuum. And as always, I want to start us off with, what were your first thoughts and impressions?
So my first thought was actually really vain. I was like, oh, this is in black and white, because there's no color in it. And that was the first thing that struck me, was that this piece was going to be in black and white, which is a very strong rhetorical choice, right, to not use color. And I liked that. I liked that theme of black and white throughout the whole memoir, right, or autobiography rather. And yeah, I liked it, but that's what struck me, kind of point blank. I was not expecting it to be in black and white.
So I think the first time I was exposed to this, it was to the novel actually, was during a bridge training, right? One of the other instructors in our school was teaching March, and so it made its way into our bridge curriculum. I remember reading it and thinking, oh, this is intense. It's not, but this isn't the typical voice that we hear, right? And this is one of the problems that I have with the way that we often teach the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, our civil rights curriculum is often reduced to, and I don't mean that negatively, it's a good thing that we do center our voices, the voices of Dr. King and Rosa Parks, but they were not the only civil rights movement leaders, right? There were others involved in this work, and they were building on a legacy that existed before them, right? It's not like civil rights has emerged out of nowhere and everything was fixed in the 60s. And I think that's one of the problems with how we teach the civil rights movement. And so in reading March, I kind of underwent that same re-education myself, right? Because I had to learn and teach myself what the civil rights movement looked like, not just during the actual movement, but before, right? Who were some of the people who contributed to the formation of the NAACP and the movement itself? And so I remember reading that, and at the time, I think it might have been you, Jen, who recommended that I teach it alongside X-Men, God Loves, Man Kills.
Ooh, that's nice pairing.
Yeah, and it worked really well. And one of the things that I remember when we were talking or discussing the novel in class was how my students were reacting to what they were seeing in March and what they were seeing in X-Men, right? And so largely the conversation kind of centered on March, right? And it was interesting because I was expecting them to be more interested in the superhero stuff, and they weren't. They were a lot more interested in March, which was a pleasant and wonderful opportunity for us to talk about March in the context of the civil rights movement, and really that these were real people, right? And that this movement isn't something that just stopped. It continues on even today, and it just looks different, right? And rather than being called the civil rights movement, we're looking at Black Lives Matter right now. We're looking at the movement at Standing Rock, right? And all of these different civil rights movements that occur because of the work of people in the 60s and before that. And so I remember reading this book and feeling like I I needed more, right? Like I didn't know enough. And that even if I was reading a lot and if I was trying to learn, that I still, whatever it was that I learned in my history classes, it was but a fraction. And so, yeah, that's kind of like, I on one hand, I was really excited to learn what I was learning and reading about John Lewis and his life, right? But on the other hand, I also felt a little betrayed by my education system, if that makes sense, right? Because I felt like I didn't, like this is stuff that I should have learned and I didn't.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you, because I remember like thinking in my brain as like elementary school or junior high school or whenever we were learning civil rights stuff, right? Was that, oh yeah, Rosa Parks started it, and then like Martin Luther King Jr. came in and fixed it, and then everyone's equal now. Like, was very much the like Cliff Notes watered down version I felt that I got.
And if you had a teacher who was a little bit more invested, then you got Malcolm X, right?
Yeah. But typically the assassination only.
Right. And
like,
so that
it's and that he was air quote violent, or more of the radical version of Dr. King, air quotes.
Right. Yes, it's always in that context, as if like they were sparring or something.
Right. Magneto and Xavier. like
yeah.
Completely agree with your points. Like, one Tori's point of like the Cliff Notes version of the civil rights, and then Brenda's articulation of being re-educated right through this graphic novel. I similarly had this experience that Brenda had, in terms of I was exposed to March via this shared curriculum that we had for Summer Bridge. It was, to explain this a little, to contextualize a little bit, we all teach at a university where we have a bridge program, a summer program that has a shared curriculum, and that within that shared curriculum, we get to choose from a number of texts that are provided for us. And so we had a sliver, a chapter, half a chapter,
only a chapter,
full chapter, a sliver of March. And Brenda and I have very strong interests in graphic novels, and so we really naturally gravitated to it. And we then were assigned a class that following the fall semester, and we were just like, wow, what are we going to do? We ended up running March alongside X-Men. And you're right, Brenda, I think that my students much preferred the autobiography. While they appreciated X-Men, they wanted more of that March. And, I wish that I'd run the entire book and not just that sliver. But because of time constraints and also resource constraints, I just had to run that sliver. But, what I experienced this March was an education, as Brenda said, of the civil rights movement. Like Tori and Brenda have, said here, like, our education really just focuses on just like main figures, right? Just like Dr. King, Malcolm X, if you're lucky, Rosa Parks, and Ruby Bridges. If
yeah, you're
right, you are exposed to the movie and like the book.
Know what though, with Ruby Bridges, that was all on my own. I don't remember actually talking about her in class. Did we? I know because you and I had the same class. That's why I'm asking, Jen.
I remember watching the movie.
Yeah.
But, I think it was around that time if like that was being pushed out, right? Like that was being, sensationalized, that particular story. Especially when we talk about like the desegregation of schools, like the landmark
cases
that were happening, right? And so, I think that like my view of the civil rights movement was constructed to be very narrow, right? And very almost in isolation to what else was happening concurrent to it as well, right? It's like, oh, this is the only thing that happened in like the time that it happened, like the 1960s, right? It was these, or maybe the time period's wrong, I'm sorry guys, but like this is the only thing that ever happened. And then once we got these landmark cases and we got these landmark decisions made, it ended. And the thing is, that's how the civil rights movement was portrayed, and it's thought about. And that's why things like Black Lives Matter continues on, because we have to re-educate ourselves to say like, no, like just because that happened, it didn't stop. Like
Right.
this is an ongoing fight. And I think that's why it's so important to have someone like John Lewis's story out there and kind of filling in that story with another story, right? Saying like, no, there were other participants in this movement, right? Just as important as like Dr. King, as Malcolm X, as Rosa Parks, as Ruby Bridges that contributed, right? And he is one, and there were many whose voices were not printed, right?
Yeah, and there's a show, it's called The Boondocks. It's very funny, it's very satirical, and they talk about that, like in a very satirical, kind of facetious way, where Granddad, so the boys are learning about civil rights at school, and Granddad's like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And they're like, well, how do you know this, Granddad? He's like, because I was there, because he was like, and then Granddad goes on to say, again, it's being satirical, and talking about these silenced voices that were not shown in civil rights movements and education, where he goes to say, he was like, Rosa wasn't the only one on that bus who refused to get up. He was like, I was there too. We planned it, but they kept ignoring me. And so like it shows the scene and like the cops come in and they're like, this singular woman is refusing to get up. And he's like, no, I'm here too. And they're just like, come with us, singular woman. And he's like, I'm also breaking the law. And they just keep ignoring him. To like, it's satirical, but it's to show that like these people who were just ignored, that also were these voices and participants. And then the joke at the end of the episode is that Granddad has major beef with Rosa Parks because of that to this day, and he prank calls her like every Sunday night, and or something like that, like, which is insane. But it's, yeah. But I liked what you were saying though, it's that connection there of, you know, silenced voices and erased name, not erased, but suppressed names from history.
Right.
And I think erase them. That's exactly the point, right? And I think this is one of those reminders that things like the civil rights movement, like Black Lives Matter, like Standing Rock, these are youth-led, right? The climate change movement, those are youth-led. And so when we elevate names like Dr. King's and Rosa Parks to like this grander status, we often erase the work of the people who are working with them. We erase the work of young people who stood on the Edmonds Bridge with them and gave up blood and freedom
and beaten and
for something that we often take for granted. Jen destroyed us earlier today by sharing. Well, do you care to tell the story, Jen? Because I don't want to cast you as a villain. I apologize.
It was very lovely, but Brenda and I both cried a lot.
Not a lot.
I had to turn off my camera and go to another room.
I kept it together because I'm a lady, but
I am not. I am clearly not a lady.
So we usually have about 30 minutes to an hour to prep before we do recordings. I like to go over talking points of Brenda and Tori and get their input, whether or not they want to add to talking points. We also kind of
Subtly calling this out.
No. We also like to do sort of just like a, debrief, kind of like settling in right before we go into the recording. So that's why it sometimes goes into an hour. So as we're doing the talking points, and I'm going over with them, I tell them I want you to read John Lewis's last written piece that was published in the New Yorker or the New York Post, one of the two, on the day of his funeral. I had read this piece the day it was published, and I was gobsmacked. I thought it was an important piece that people should read. I didn't get many participants reading it, actually, from my friend group, which is upsetting, but they also have lives. And it was also access restricted because you had to kind of subscribe to the publication. So I ended up kind of having a copy of it, and I shared it with Brenda and Tori, and it was a piece wherein kind of Lewis wrote it near days before he died, and where he sort of commends the work that our youth are doing on the streets, and and, you know, in their homes, in their offices, wherever, and, you know, kind of charges them to keep going. You know, he kind of says, you know, I've done what I can, but I know that I am going to leave the world in good hands, maybe even better hands, because you guys have been so inspiring, as you know, and you have shown the world that you are not going to be beaten down, and you are going to keep going forward. I thought it was important for Brenda and Tori to read this to kind of contextualize March a little bit before we talk about March, because I think what he does in March is what he does in the letter as well.
Yeah. So the title is "Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation," and so you can find it on the New York Times. We'll try and link it below once we post this video. But there's a number of things that he talks about, and I think one of the things that struck me most was when he says democracy is an act, right? We have to participate for it to exist, for it to be a thing. And I think, you know, I think I've spoken a few times about, and especially today actually, about the failures of our education system. And that's one of the things that I am grateful specifically to my teacher in high school for highlighting not just that my civic duty as a voter is important, but its value to me on an everyday basis, right? And I don't just mean the big general elections, right? I mean the small local ones that nobody pays attention to that we have every single year. Those that actually impact me when I walk out of my house or when I'm sitting at my home with my family, right? Those are the elections that we have to participate in, because people have, it's not just about, well, it is actually a lot about their sacrifice, right? It is a right that we have, but people have bled for it. People have fought to have, so that I, as a woman, a Latina woman in 2020, can have that right to vote, right? That is important. And that's a civic responsibility that we all owe, and we owe a debt of gratitude to people like John Lewis, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, who stood up and demanded civil rights. And it is something that we will continue to owe to people who are fighting and protesting for justice, for equality, for all of these things that we need on a daily basis just to survive and hopefully thrive if we're lucky. I hate that I said that, because it, like, if we're lucky to thrive, right? Like that's an awful sentiment too. I don't know. I'm rambling now. You guys can, I'm going to take a moment to think about that.
A line that really stood out to me in March that I've been thinking about all morning is when Jen had mentioned it briefly in our pre-meeting or pre-recording debrief, but the kind of the take the win, right? Like you got something, but then Lewis goes on to say, like, yeah, they said we were going to get partial integration, but I saw it as partial segregation. And I was like, absolutely. Like, and that's been a line that has just been stuck in my head all morning. It was just this, like, because everyone's like, take the win, you got something, like they're gonna like make it a little bit better. And he's like, but it's not all the way better. And I refuse to stop until it is, because partial integration is just partial segregation.
Well, and it speaks to, I mean, and I think when you look at a scene like that, right, where I think it's, you mentioned it was Thurgood Marshall who said that, right? And you look at civil rights leaders as they age, right? And it's not just civil rights leaders. Really, it's leaders of, or pioneers, I would guess, I guess is the word for it, who have worked within the system, right? And this idea that we can change the system if we're working from within, and how that kind of progress is glacial. It's really slow and methodical. And for people, for young people, I think, especially in seeing something like that, you see the generational divide, right? These leaders have been working within the system for years, and they're like, well, we will get that change. It just takes time, right? And then you see younger people, like in this case, John Lewis, come in and he's like, no, I want the change now, right? We deserve the change now. And I think if nothing else, that definitely speaks to how generations kind of change and evolve, right? The way that fighting for civil rights and for justice, social justice in the 60s looked similar yet very different for someone living in 2020, right? And I think that's something that we often forget as we age, right? We have to remember that the struggle may feel the same, but the ways that we go about dismantling these structures of racism and social inequity, they have to change, right? Our tactics have to change because racism is so insidious and it changes and adapts. And so our tactics need to change and adapt. And for that, we have to listen to young people.
Right. I think the impatience of youth typically gets the job, like gets things moving, right? They are usually the powder keg that launches things, right? And I think the graphic novel definitely touches upon that sort of implicit tension between these generations, of new young civil rights activists versus those who are older and have more experience in the civil rights movement, right? And just the tension of how to get things done, right? And I think it's something that we ourselves are seeing with BLM, right? As folks get just, I remember our history professor teacher in high school, and it's the same one Brenda and I share, kind of talking about like why more liberal Democrats or more extreme political alignments tend to become more moderate and centralist as they get older. And it's because they start amassing more wealth and more property, right? You start to have a greater stakehold in society, and so you start fearing about what you can lose, right? Because you have more to lose in a sense, right? You start thinking about, oh, what's going to happen to my house? What's going to happen to, well, how many taxes do I have to pay now, right? And so because your stake in society is larger, your fear becomes larger as well. And you see that in the graphic novel as well, as Lewis is coming up as a young man and his family, the graphic novel opens with Lewis reminiscing, right? This is on the eve of Obama's inauguration in office, and he goes to the office because he's going to go sit in the inauguration, and he ends up meeting these young citizens, and he ends up recounting sort of his life story a little bit to them, and he talks about how his family and his dad particularly, managed to buy the farm with $140 that he earned as a crop share, and how only money he had to his name. And so, as Lewis is growing up and he's getting more involved in the civil rights movement in his own way, right, by trying to become a preacher and such, he has this opportunity to possibly file suit against a university for not accepting him into their cohort. And Dr. King, who he's meeting with at the time, says, like, he explains to him all the things that could happen, right? And like, because you're a minor, your parents will have to file in your name. Mm-hmm. And you have to get permission, and you have to go talk it over with your family. And so he does, and while his family is supportive at first, they rescind that support as they start thinking about it, because they start to fear for their own lives, for their neighbors' lives in terms of retaliation, right? And kind of losing what they already have. And so you see that, in that, while Lewis wants to push forward, you see his family sort of kind of rescind a little bit, and those around that age too rescind a little bit, because they have a larger stake and they don't want to lose that, right? They're afraid of losing what they've gained. And so I think the graphic novel does a really great job of sort of nuancing those conflicts, right? And why people choose to participate and not participate.
Emphasizing that there is no shame in that, right? Particularly for Lewis, because his family is not just economically threatened, though we know that is a huge concern, right? But their lives could be in danger, because there are people out there that if he sues this university for access, so there are people out there who will make the choice to go and physically hurt him and his family, right? And this is when people were burning and bombing different institutions that they perceived as transgressive, right? And in this case, it would have been his family's farm. And when he talked to Dr. King, he says, I'm not willing to put my family at risk. And Dr. King's like, yeah, we get it.
Yeah.
And I think that nuance is important to realize, right? Because we often think of all the there's a weird martyrdom that comes with the sacrifices that one makes, right? And the reality is that in this case, and in a lot of cases, those sacrifices look like lives, right? They are lives that you're putting on the line, and that's dangerous, and that's scary. That's terrifying, actually.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Right. And I think, you're highlighting a great kind of theme in Lewis's book and Lewis's story is choices, right? And the nuances that come out of this track a little bit, though, and kind of just, go back to talking about and start us off a little bit on like what you thought about Lewis's choice to portray his story as a graphic novel. What did you think about that choice, and what is that, how does that play into our kind of common theme of access? Because we've talked a little bit about access with other titles.
I think
so. Lewis gave. Go ahead. Go ahead, Tori.
So for me, there's a few things that I think goes on here, right? I think that comics, graphic novels, I think do two things. It makes things easier to read oftentimes because we're less afraid of things that have pictures, but also you can show things very descriptively, right? Like, it's one thing to like be told people had a look of disgust on their face. It's another to see it drawn on their face, right? Like when you can just see how angry people are, that people are demanding equality, and things like that, right? It's such a powerful tool, and I think that is very likely a reason why it was chosen for the graphic novel, just because I mean, we get these like giant autobiographies all the time that are like 800 pages and people like telling their lives, and it's like, I don't know, that just has this like dry feeling to it. It's not youth led, it's not youth felt, right? That like, I don't feel like if it were not like a traditional novel, teenage youth in immersing themselves in activism would pick that up right now, right? And read like a 800-page autobiography in the first person, like, you know what I mean? Like, and then the framing of adding the two children and that he's reminiscing, talking about, allows him to jump to and from his memories without needing to follow any type of like path trajectory. Like he can be like, oh, I was on this farm and then we did this, oh, then back on that farm, this is where I learned this, and then I was in this, like he's able to kind of conversationally jump through the timeline, which I think is also a really powerful helping tool.
So two things. You mentioned that there's an accessibility thing about graphic novels, right? And I think graphic novels pull on the legacy of picture books, right? Which we traditionally think of narratives specifically geared toward children. And so there is, I mean, one of the things we have to realize is the complexity of the relationship that exists between the text and the image, right? And so the meaning making, or the co-creation that happens between the reader and the author and the image and text that they're seeing, that's a really complex relationship that occurs. That said, it is drawing on a narrative form that is been tried and true, right, in terms of education for young readers. I think the narrative frame that he uses at the very beginning makes it very explicit who the intended audience is, right? This is a novel meant for children. This is an access point, right? Because when we think about history, we think about years and years and years of information and facts that we have to remember for some way, shape, or form. But this is an access point, right? And I think it's really interesting because when we think of access points for like things like DC and Marvel, right? There's so many stories, there's so many universes. When we like, where do you start, right? I remember feeling that way when I first started reading comic books. I was a little lost and I didn't know where to start. And the funny thing about this novel is that it actually does that the opposite. This is an access point for the civil rights movement. This is how you become interested and have some foot in the door so that you start understanding how people were treated, and the levels of discrimination and the way and the insidiousness of this, and how human the people working to dismantle these structures were, right? And that they had families. They weren't this picture in a textbook. They were real people living their daily lives and experiencing some awful and forms of violence, right? And experiencing that and then being in prison for them. One of the things that really struck me in the novel is when he's talking about his backpack, right? He had a few things. He had 2 books and an apple, I think, or an orange. He had some fruit because he knew that they were going to be jailed or imprisoned, and he wanted something to read and he wanted something to eat. And I think about that and I'm like, those are choices we all make, right? We know we're going to go somewhere. So if it's going to be a long distance thing, I'm going to need something to listen to, right? Because if I'm driving, something needs to be playing, right? And I'm going to need water. Like those really everyday mundane choices really do go a long way to humanizing these historic and often larger than life figures. And I really appreciated the way that Mr. Lewis presented that. And the other thing I think, and this is not in the novel, this is something you can Google on YouTube yourself, is his humor. Man was just so funny and just is such a lovely, beautiful human being. There's a few scenes of, not scenes, sorry, there's a few clips of him like after giving this really big speech, and he'll come down the steps and there'll be music playing and he'll just start dancing because, you know, it's just, I think we elevate oftentimes people, right, with huge regards. And I'm sorry if this is coming off as a fangirl. Actually, I'm not sorry at all. I totally am a fangirl, not just of his legacy, but of the person he was, right? And I think he's the type of person we should all kind of aspire to be, because just he conducted himself with such kindness and such grace on a daily basis that it was beautiful to see. And so, but again, I didn't know anything about John Lewis when I was young, right? This is something that I actually taught myself as an adult, and I started to look for him. And in this novel, I think those moments, right, those really small moments where he's like thinking about what he's going to put in his backpack, really bring back the idea that, you know, these are people, the people that, you know, we're all capable of engaging in our civic duty and responsibility in a meaningful and profound way. We just need to be intentional and present and committed and kind. And it sounds so simple, and yet, you know, for all the reasons that the novel outlines, it can be very difficult for folks.
Yeah, I thought, you know, choosing to portray his life in a graphic novel form was such an inspired choice. Like Tori said, it could have just been a regular autobiography written in a novel form, or even a documentary narrated by Ken Burns, right? Played on PBS. But to make it into a graphic novel, I think, one, furthers the conversation that, text can be any type of text, right? That like, it doesn't, that, when we are all English majors here, and we're all trained in a certain canon. And that canon is very white, but it's also very traditional. And by traditional, I mean, it's very linguist heavy, very text heavy. It's very read a book heavy. And so it's very conventionally heavy in that regard. So like graphic novels have recently entered that conversation and given more notice as a property or a genre that needs to give more attention and can actually do a lot of good work in terms of furthering conversations, furthering theory, and furthering themes that are consistent in just traditional novels. To have his story portrayed in a graphic novel, I think, one, like Brenda said, provides an access point for children to sort of start, learning about the civil rights movement through something as simple as a graphic novel, because it's words and visuals together, right? But, to Tori's point, I think it also nuances the story in that we're able to see just more emotional and gestural modes happening across the page. So like one of the striking moments in, this book one was when his uncle picks up John to the north because his family has noticed that he has a strong interest in education, and so his uncle is a principal and a school teacher, and so they really have sort of decided to invest in John in that regard. And so his uncle comes from the north, and he comes to pick up John and take him to spend the summer with him up north. And what they decide to illustrate is that path across the south to the north, and how in that narration you have John talking about like how his uncle had taken this trip before, so he knew which counties to avoid, where he and John could take a bathroom break. They had to pack lunch. They had to bring the restaurant with him because it was not safe for them to go out and eat and go dine in. And so he said they didn't stop. His uncle didn't stop being nervous until they got to Ohio.
I think it was his uncle didn't breathe till they got to Ohio. I remember that line. Yeah.
And so then he didn't breathe until they got to Ohio too, and that's when he started to relax. And in that kind of those panels, you see just the sweat dropping off, the side of his uncle's forehead, and like that nervousness and that tension that exists.
The wider eyes.
Right, as they drive through the South. And so I thought in that moment, you're feeling as an audience member that tension. And it's something that, while could be portrayed and shared in a text, is more striking visually, right? And I think that, like, again, like when I go back to, I think Lewis's choice to make his story into a graphic novel is inspired because he was one of the last big six of the civil rights movement leaders, right? And so he's had, he opens in the graphic novel saying like he's the last one, right, that's still living among that big group of civil rights leaders. And so he's had the opportunity to live a fuller life than they have. And so I think in knowing that, like, not, he also knows, I think, in that point that like he has more to say, and it's almost too much to say, and maybe needs too much to say in just a novel form that just will be erased. And I think he wants to add to the conversation in this way because he knows that like Dr. King's letter is out there, his speech is out there, right? And his speech, I Have a Dream, and also his letter to Birmingham jail is out there, and then Malcolm X's pieces are out there, and they're all kind of in this kind of linguistic mode. And I think his choice to portray his story in a graphic novel differentiates his story from their story, but adds nuance to the conversation of the civil rights movement.
So he gave an interview about his graphic novel, and he talked about how surprised he was when Andrew Aiden came up to him and was like, I have an idea. I give presentations at Comic-Con every year, and I think your life would be great to depict in a graphic novel. And John Lewis laughed. He didn't get this. He's like, what am I going to be doing at a Comic-Con convention? And the thing that I think speaks to this larger issue, right, about listening to young people, I think here's a very beautiful example of that, right? John Lewis looking at Andrew Aiden and saying, okay, let's do this, right? This is the form that young people today use to communicate with. It's not social media or anything, but it is the way that they consume information in a lot of ways, right? we have superhero movies coming out that are based on graphic novels, so let's try it. And so to see that, I think, again, it just speaks to this man's soul, right? But it also speaks to the ways that we communicate, right, with each other, not just linguistically, right, through text, but also the way that we want to teach these lessons of society and of our history to younger audiences, right? The way that we develop books and the way that the genre evolves and changes. You know, we talk about diversity in media, right? Publishing is very white. It still is, right? And so to see that this is a movement that we're seeing, not just talking about, right? We're actually seeing works produced by people of color to give us not just access, but to communicate our histories, right? In this case, Black history and Black history in the way that it impacted American history, right? I think that's important to have that context for young people and for younger readers. I do think it's a larger discussion too about the ways that we're children's literature is also evolving, but you know, my teacher brain will stop now because yeah.
No, I think that, you know, I appreciate that you brought that into the conversation, that like he, you know, he himself was sort of like, I don't even understand this, right? But then he gave it a chance, right? He chose to portray his story in this form. And I think that in that way, like because he decided to do that, we get to see him more as that kind soul that you keep reiterating he was, right? He, that kind, funny soul that, you know, he was, in that like the small little things that are embedded in the graphic novel to humanize him, right? Like when the pair of children come to his office and they notice the little chicken figurines that are all around, and they're like, why do you like chicken so much, sir? Right? Like, why didn't you become a chicken farmer? And that kind of, you know, spins a memory for him. You know, it's those little things that I think would be missed otherwise if it didn't form. And I want to talk a little bit about like just the choice of black and white, because Tori kind of opened it up to that, right? Like, what did we think about that choice of portraying a story in black and white?
I have a few, like, I'm of a few minds on it. Part of me thinks that it was a way to kind of keep the art simplistic, so that way the message gets across, right? So you're not getting bogged down on like, wow, look how gorgeous this art is. Let's not really pay attention to everything else that's going on, right? Because I feel like that can vary, like, an example that I like to use with that in my class is Monstrous, because the art in that is so stunning that like I don't even care about what's being said. Like I'm so blown away by the art, and I feel like that the art can become a double-edged sword, right? If it's too amazing, it's subject to stealing the show, but also if it's too simplistic, here we are talking about it, right? But I do think that the lack of color and the simple lines, and I felt like the lines were also drawn very soft, also helps create this way of like dealing with cultural trauma, national trauma in a way that's a little more, I don't want to say palatable, because that's not the word I'm looking for, but like digestible perhaps, like, you know, in a way that we can intake this without like shutting down and feeling like all hope is lost. And if it was that bad in the 50s and we've not really come that far, why bother? Like, does that make sense? Like, to not have like that defeatist kind of sink in, I guess.
I think it also centers the story and history. Think about when we first started to get color TVs.
Right.
Right. Those didn't necessarily become as popular till after the 60s, right? Oftentimes popular media, I'm thinking about like shows like I Love Lucy and the Andy Griffith Show, because those were playing on at 5 a.m. when I was getting ready for school. So that's what I would watch before I went to school. And those were all in black and white, right? And so I think part of it is to remind us that this happened a while ago, right? This is before we had these blockbuster movies that are vivid and bright and in your face with just color and graphics, right? It is, I think one of the things is he often thought of himself as a simple man, right? And so I think that that what you were talking about, that desire to center it in simplicity, right? That this is a story, just a human story like any other. I think that's part of the rhetorical choice too. And I do think everything that you said applies, as does this. So I think that this is a very layered choice for multiple reasons.
Yeah, I think that, the choice to go black and white really sort of reinforces the themes in the book too, and just like the
Absolutely.
kind of basic analysis of the book, right? Like we're assigning this to our students, like the black and white reinforces the themes of, the themes of segregation that are in the book, the themes of racism that are the topics of racism and segregation that are talked about in the book, right? Just even the way that folks in the novel even think about things in almost binary terms or binary spheres, right? Like it's not just black and white, right? Axis or no axis. It's also like violence or non-violence, right? Because John Lewis, does take that non-violence approach, right? And there is a do's and don'ts list that he composes, and I thought that's a beautiful kind of panel that I always try to highlight when I'm discussing the text, where he it's a Lewis writes, and Lewis kind of narrates that as their sit-in movements are getting bigger and people are gaining more interest, more youth are getting more involved, and yet while that's great, they also have not been trained in nonviolent stressors, right?
And there's no time to train them.
Right. And so he comes up with the simple do's and don'ts. What happens when people are calling you certain names? What do you do when people are calling you certain names? Or what do you do when people are resorting to violence, right? What's your response to that, right? And so just highlighting that binary list of do's and don'ts, right, just again is reinforced by that choice of black and white, right? Panels, and that a lot of what's happening during this period is almost binary in nature, right? It is this or that, and almost, I think the black and white kind of hits you as a reader. It's like, why is it binary, right? Why am I not getting this color, right? Like, why are people thinking this way, and why are people reacting in these kind of binary terms? And so I think that it sort of adds to that kind of feeling of frustration for the reader too, that you're only consistently getting black and white throughout the panels. Were there other scenes for you too that sort of, kind of struck you?
So I've actually been reading essays on March this last week. So there's a lot of scenes that really kind of hit me. There was something that one of my students wrote about the chicken scene. And particular, and this is all credit to my student, this is their brilliance, not mine, but my student pointed out the immense sense of kindness that came across, right, with Lewis's relationship to the chickens, right? So he in the novel, he talks about how he would take the chickens and talk to them, and really just they became his friends. And so he had like a crisis every time that one of the chickens was either sold off because his family needed money, or one of the chickens was killed because they needed dinner, right? And so I think the way that he framed that was when he talks about the complicatedness of that relationship that he had with his chickens. He loved his chickens, right? But his family also needed the chickens to survive, and he also loved his family, right? And I think that's such a beautiful way of contextualizing the nuance that you were talking about earlier, right? Of having these choices and having to kind of think about where your choice is going to land, and having to make those difficult decisions for yourself and for your family, right? And I think the story with the chickens is such a beautiful way of kind of introducing this very complicated adult process for a child, right? Because a child will recognize, yeah, I love my animals. Yeah, but I also eat chicken, right? Like that's the kind of thing, and I really love that scene. But again, that was one of those scenes that really struck me because one of my students pointed out how profound it was, and yeah. And also, it's just a teachable moment, one of those beautiful moments where your students point out something that you haven't really seen.
Right.
So,
Yeah. A scene for me that really stood out was when he's going through the nonviolent training with his classmates, and it's so intense. And I think at one point he is just like, I can't do this. And he has to like walk away for a little bit. Like it was kind of like just like a brief breaking point. Like he was just like, this is too much. Like he was getting up. They got under his skin, right? Like it was like because they take turns practicing on, people are saying these like awful things to you. Like how are you going to respond? And like
both physically and verbally harassing you, right? Yeah. That was one of those points that I had to put the book down.
Me too.
I have to come back to it because like, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a point where he just is like, I can't, like this is I can't, like I'm not going to be nonviolent much longer if I just need to like, he doesn't say that, but like he's like needs to take a minute and then he's good.
Yeah, I think his like colleague walks out, right? Like
yeah,
not him, it's his colleague.
Yeah. Oh, it's the call. I'm sorry, my bad.
The colleague's like, I can't do this anymore. I'll contribute some other way. Like if you need posters, maybe I can do that. But
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to this continuous theme that that we keep coming back to, right? That we kind of had this at the beginning, is choices, right? And the choices that you make are your own, and how you choose to participate is your choice, right? I remember this one scene too earlier in the graphic novel that about John's choice to continue going to school even during harvesting season, and how that was such a huge decision to make because his family depended on his skills and his labor during harvesting season, right? We're still talking like, while they did own this massive amount of property, and in a way they were wealthy in that way, they were still just dependent on themselves to make do, right? And so they really depended on their children to contribute to their family. But John is, recognizes that he needs to go and get an education and chooses to defy his father and go to school. And sort of, this discussion of like, I think he kind of says, I think my father knew that like that this wasn't going to stop me, right? That this was my choice. But it speaks to, again, a choice that many of us also kind of can like also understand, of choosing to go to college, for example, and how that even separates us from our family, right? Because suddenly we are not the same to them. Adds nuance and conflict.
That's interesting that you thought about your own experience, because when I read that, I thought about the stories I heard growing up about my mom with her family and what a struggle it was for her to go to school, because she was the oldest. And so my family, they farmed. They were essentially the Salvadoran version of crop sharing, right? They didn't own the land. They worked it, and they were allowed a portion of it. And so my grandfather had kids, and so the oldest had to go with him, and my mom was the oldest, right? And so she would wake up every morning before the crack of dawn, right? And go do that daily hike up into what's the English word for cerro? You know, Jen? It's like a hill, but not really. Okay. Anyway, so she had to like climb up, right? And the whole like, it's the thing that most of us make fun of, as like, not, we don't make fun of, but within the Latino community, we're like, oh yeah, if you didn't grow up hearing stories about your parents not having shoes to go up to, right? Like that stuff, because those were the stories that I grew up with, right? My mom would talk about how she didn't have shoes to go up to. Every time that I didn't want to go to school, she would guilt trip me essentially, about how difficult it was for her. But that's what I thought about, right? And in her case, her parents hid her books so that she wouldn't go, right? Because they're like, no, we need to make ends meet. You have to stay and help. And I know I talk a lot about like crying through like emotionally reading, but that was one of those scenes that I remember falling apart at and just thinking about her struggle, not necessarily my own struggle with being first gen. But now that you pointed out, Jen, oh damn. Yeah.
Well, I think whenever a person makes a choice to prioritize anything, right? Just anything in terms of just, in this case, education, they're making a choice for themselves, right? And not necessarily for others in that particular moment, right? Like, I think, Lewis eventually comes back, right? Like, as we all come back to our own families with our own gained wealth and, our own gained knowledge for their profit, right? Because we're trying to elevate up, right? But it is a choice that in the moment does fragment the family environment, right? It does kind of drive a schism and create a schism between what you grew up with and what you're aiming for, right? And so I think that's completely an experience of first gen individuals, right? It's completely our experience. I mean, we might not have had the same struggles as our own parents, but they themselves had their own struggles that created schisms, right? We created schisms, and I think John Lewis's story highlights the schism he created too, right, for his family. But it's, out of that schism, then, he ended up recontributing to both his family and society at large with the work that he did and during the civil rights and as a senator, right? What for me, like for me, it was so striking for him to want to begin his story during the inauguration of Barack Obama as president. I enjoyed that, like him waking up and taking a shower as he's listening to the radio and this kind of small Washington apartment, right? And him going to the office and and them telling him, like, you need to wear a scarf, it's so cold. And he kind of throws in the lines like, hey, I sat in on like less than 40 degrees weather, I can weather this cold, no worries. But I thought it was such an interesting choice to start his story there. What did you guys make of that?
Actually, before we move on, he was a senator? I thought he was a congressman.
Yeah, he was part of Congress.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. You mentioned earlier than his time in the Senate. I'm like, wait, I thought he was in the... Sorry. My brain is running a little slow today.
I really like that scene though, where he was saying, like, I think he says something like, oh, it's cold, like you wear the scarf, where's your hat? And he kind of flashes back and then says, right, like, oh yeah, the first protest we did, there was 1.5 feet of snow and like we weren't complaining then, so, or something to that extent. And I really liked that as well, to kind of show like kind of like, like this kind of full circle, like, oh, this is nothing, like you real cute thinking this is cold, like when I've weathered the storm and things like that. I really liked that.
Yeah, that coming back to that moment in history is so lovely, right? Because he's talking about the struggles of the civil rights movement, and he brings it back to his reality. And he's at this moment where we're about to inaugurate our first Black president, right? That's a moment, right? I think, and it goes back to those like small human moments, right? Where he's like, oh, someone wants to give him his scarf, and he's like, no, but then you're not gonna have a scarf. Why are you giving me your scarf, right? And the person, I think it's an aide or something, who's like, no, I'm gonna be inside. I'm not even gonna be outside. You keep it, please, sir, right? And it's just this really, it's funny but sweet moment and this exchange, right? In light of what's about to happen, right? It's this huge historic moment that he's about to go be a part of, and he's had so many of those historic moments that he's been a part of, that again, those grounding moments I think are really important.
Right. And I like too that they gave him this, like, because I feel like that's a very like regular response that like air quote regular people would have to like a national treasure. Like they're like, oh, like I must protect you. Like please, here's a scarf, here's a jacket. Like, right? Like no one's gonna like walk by and see like Maya Angelou without a coat in the snow and not give, you know what I mean? They're gonna be like, Maya, please, what are you doing, Miss Angelou? Like, right? Like it's just like we don't do that. Like, you know what I mean? It's like I like that they gave that like kind of feeling and vibe to it. Like, yeah.
I thought it was, I thought it was also like part of like Lewis kind of again passing on that torch. He does it in his final publication to the youth that are leading the BLM movements, right? But I thought it was also like him starting his story with the inauguration. I think also sort of a passing of the torch, or even a culmination of all his efforts, right? To that kind of next generation, right? Almost saying like, okay, I got us. I was part of that movement that got us here. All right, Barack. All right, Obama. Let's see where you take us next, right? It almost felt like a hand toss, and also kind of a combination of all that effort, right? But also with that, the work isn't done yet. Right? And because he also kind of centers a story in his office, right? And you're right, Brenda, I did call him senator. He's a congressman. It goes back to him going back to the office and working at the office, and almost saying that the work doesn't just stop because we have elected a Black man to the highest office in the land. The work continues and must continue, right?
It goes back to the fact that he has 2 children who are in his office learning about him. It's almost as if there's a suggestion here that, right now it's Obama's turn to continue this fight. Kids, you're up next, right? Like this is going to continue. This is going to be something. And I love how you put that.
Yeah. And even so, like he even also like kind of built off a memory too, like begins with a memory of like him on the bridge and someone asked him, do you know how to swim, John? We might need to swim, right? Yeah. And I think that's actually the first kind of scene that we open with, and then go to the inauguration. But I think that simple like question also speaks to just the movement and the work itself, right? Even if you don't know how to do it, you just got to do it. So even though like he didn't know how to swim, and there was a possibility that he had to maybe jump off this bridge to survive and figure it out, is also kind of a nice little metaphor, is that what it is, of the work that needs to be done, right? That sometimes you just don't have all the tools at your disposal, but you have to do what's right.
Yeah.
Right. And he says that in his final publications too. Right. So, I think we talked a little, we talked a lot about Lewis's life, and I don't know if we hit every point that we needed to make, but how do you see his work, his legacy informing our month's theme and the choices that we're going to talk about this month?
So this month we really have we've chosen a lot of young voices, I think, or the stories of young people.
So yeah, demonstrate.
Yeah, and so I think that's exactly what, I mean, we're starting off with this huge historic moment, right? That should be common knowledge and something that every single American knows, understands, and talks about, right? And I think in the choices that we have planned for this month, I was going to say week. Time isn't real anymore, though, so it doesn't matter. Time week, whatever. Timesphere. Timey-wimey, yeah. I think it sets up the legacy, right? It sets up the fact that, and you can see the impact of that, right? We've moved from a moment where we absolutely had to address racial injustice and inequality, and we have to continue addressing it, right? But now that movement extends to the media that we consume as well, right? And in telling the stories of not just white folks and not just Black folks, but Indigenous folks and brown folks and everyone, right? So that we understand that our current reality is one that is rooted in diversity, right? And it draws its strength from those diverse voices, right? That democracy is an act that we have to participate in, but that means that we all have to participate in it, so that we are all heard and we understand the stories that each of us have to tell, right? So that we understand the life perspective from somebody who doesn't share our life experience, right? Like for me, I know what it's like to be Salvi American, right? But I may not understand what it's like to be Black. So I need to read those stories and talk to people and really educate myself, so that when I'm at the polls, right, I'm not just voting for my own self-interest, but I'm voting for that of my neighbor, right? I'm voting for a collective good.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well.
That gets a gay snaps for that one.
You know, that's weird. You know, I want to kind of go back to like John Lewis's last publication. He writes, and I'm pulling it up right now. He writes, "While my time here has come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you have inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity." And, you know, I really wanted to highlight that because he really is just passing on that torch and saying like, okay, I did what I could. Now it's your time, right? Continue the work. You're doing good work. And I think that's always, you see it in March too, like his legacy is, it's coming from that boy preaching in the barn with his chickens, right? He's a preacher at heart, right? And he's preaching to say, we need the work needs to continue. And he's always coming from like sort of this education for betterment kind of standpoint. And I think part of that, his legacy stands as that, right? And his letter definitely stands as that. And I think part of that legacy is kind of reinforcing why representation matters, right? And especially seeing why representation matters starting from a very young age, right? And I think the work that, the choices that we're going to make this month really highlight these diverse voices who are, one, breaking the child model of what we grew up with, right? And demonstrating that childhood can look in all shapes and sorts and can look as weird, as normal, as whatever, and it is still a childhood, right? And I think we're going to be talking about Miss Marvel. We're going to be Kamala Khan as Miss Marvel. We're going to be talking about Miles Morales as Spider-Man. We're going to be talking about Victor from Love, Victor. And I think, and Davi from Never Have I Ever. And they're all young upcoming voices that are adding to the conversation because, they are pushing us forward, because the youth really have demonstrated that they are pushing us forward and always will push us forward to be better humans, right?
So with that in mind, that is it for us this week. We just want to take a moment and genuinely just thank John Lewis and all of the leaders of the civil rights back then and all of the leaders of the civil rights right now. We are all in your debt. Thank you. We'll see you next week. Stay safe, wear your masks, maintain physical distance as much as you possibly can, and stay safe out there. Bye, everyone.